I swear, that dog walked straight out of the woods, dropped the kitten at my feet, and collapsed like he'd just run a marathon with a backpack full of bricks. That's the first thing I told the paramedics when they showed up. I didn't know what else to say. I mean, how do you explain something like that without sounding like you've completely lost your mind? It was a Wednesday morning, just past opening time, and I had barely gotten the coffee brewing at our little animal shelter in Ridgewood when the storm let up for the first time in 3 days. The sky was still brooding, low clouds dragging themselves across the hills like tired ghosts, but the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and I was just getting ready to go check the outdoor pens. That's when he came, limping, soaked, mud-caked. A big golden mutt with deep eyes and a coat that looked like it hadn't seen a brush in years. And in his mouth, barely breathing, was a tiny gray kitten, maybe 6 or 7 weeks old, her fur matted with blood and grime. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He just walked right up to the shelter's front steps, laid the kitten down as gently as a feather, and collapsed. I shouted for Pam, my co-worker, and dropped to my knees. The dog was still breathing, but his chest was rising and falling in that scary, uneven way that makes you wonder if every breath will be the last. His paws were raw, his nails broken, and his nose had fresh cuts. The kitten, somehow, was alive, but barely. I scooped her up first, wrapping her in the hem of my sweater. She made the smallest sound, like a broken squeak toy, then went still. Pam came flying out with towels, and I told her to get my keys. We didn't have time for questions. We bundled both animals into my truck and drove straight to Dr. Landry's vet clinic across town. Dr. Landry didn't even blink when we burst in. He's been working with us for over a decade. He's seen cats rescued from burning barns, dogs caught in coyote traps, even a raccoon once that someone tried to keep as a pet and failed miserably. But this was something else. He took the kitten first. "Legs broken," he said as he gently inspected her. "Lacerations on the back. Infection starting. We need to clean her up and get some fluids in her. She might lose the leg." Pam looked like she was going to cry. I focused on the dog. He brought her here. He carried her. Dr. Landry nodded slowly. "Then he's a hero. But he's in bad shape too. Let's get him on a table." We laid him out, and that's when I saw the full extent of it. His ribs stuck out like rails. Old scars crisscrossed his flanks. He had a wound on his shoulder that was fresh, but it looked like something had already tried to lick it clean. His pads were blistered. One eye was a little cloudy. He'd been through something. Maybe a lot of somethings. While Dr. Landry and his team got to work, I sat in the waiting room with Pam. Neither of us said much. The sound of machines beeping and the occasional bark from the back were the only things breaking the silence. The rain started up again, tapping on the window like a nervous kid. I don't know how long we waited. An hour? 2? Eventually, Dr. Landry came out, wiping his hands. "They're both going to make it," he said. Just like that. The kind of sentence that makes the world feel a little less heavy. "The kitten's got a rough road ahead, but we stabilized her. Set the leg. She'll need surgery later. As for the dog, well, he's tougher than he looks." "Any idea how far he might have come?" I asked. Dr. Landry shrugged. "Hard to say. But those feet didn't get like that from walking across a yard. My guess? Several miles. Maybe more. And he didn't eat recently. He gave everything he had to get here." Pam let out a long breath. "We need to find out where he came from. If he has an owner." "He doesn't," I said before I could stop myself. "I mean, He might have, once, but not recently. Dr. Landry nodded. He's not microchipped, no collar, no recent grooming. He's a stray, but smart and loyal. That kitten's alive because of him. We brought them both back to the shelter later that afternoon. The rain had lightened again, just enough to see the mountains in the distance. The kitten was still groggy from anesthesia, swaddled in a towel-lined box with a heated pad. The dog, we started calling him Bear because of his size and gentle eyes, was resting in one of the recovery kennels. We gave him soft food, and he licked it up weakly, but gratefully. Over the next few days, word got out. People in town started showing up with donations. Blankets, kitten formula, even chew toys. One local bakery sent over day-old bread and pastries for the volunteers. We put a photo of Bear and the kitten on our website, and it went viral. Suddenly, folks from out of state were emailing, asking how they could help. A woman from Vermont sent $100 with a note that said, "For the guardian angel dog and his kitten." We kept Bear and the kitten together as much as we could. Despite her injuries, the kitten, we named her Whiskers, would crawl toward Bear whenever she heard him nearby. And Bear? He'd lift his tired head and scoot closer, tail thumping faintly, just enough to touch her nose with his. It was like they needed each other to heal. One night, I stayed late to monitor Whiskers after a round of antibiotics. The storm had passed completely by then, and the sky was clear for the first time in a week. I brought my folding chair into the recovery room and just sat with them, Bear snoozing gently in his bed, Whiskers curled beside him like a tiny shadow. I thought about how they'd ended up here, about the choices Bear must have made. Somewhere out there, he'd found this broken kitten. Could have left her. Could have let nature take its course. But something in him said no. He picked her up and walked. For miles. Through wind and rain and mud. And he made it. He saved her. Then he let himself fall. That night, I made a promise. I didn't know where this story would go. If Bear would be adopted, if Whiskers would keep her leg, if they'd end up staying together. But I knew one thing. I wouldn't let either of them go through anything alone again. If you had told me a week ago that I'd be rearranging the entire back half of the shelter to accommodate a dog and a kitten who wouldn't stop cuddling, I would have laughed and told you we didn't even have enough room for the dogs already in our care. But here I was, hauling an old mattress into the corner of the rehab room so Bear and Whiskers could have a shared space to recover without stressing the other animals out. And frankly, it was working. The moment I laid the mattress down and layered it with clean towels and fleece blankets, Bear padded over slowly, circled once, then dropped his tired body with a heavy sigh. Whiskers, who could finally hobble without assistance thanks to the temporary splint, tottered right after him and curled against his belly like she'd done it 100 times before. Pam stood in the doorway, holding a bag of kibble in one hand and a bottle of kitten formula in the other. She watched them for a moment, and then shook her head with a grin. "You ever think maybe that dog's more human than some of the folks who drop off animals here?" "All the time," I said. "He's got more sense, too." We kept things quiet that day. No visitors, no new rescues, no barking dogs bouncing off the kennel walls. Just Bear and Whiskers, curled together under a patch of afternoon sunlight, both sleeping for the first time without twitching at every sound. It felt like peace. But peace doesn't last long at shelters like ours. By morning, the phones were ringing again. A box of puppies dumped behind the grocery store. A raccoon caught in a fishing line. A senior lab surrendered because his owners were moving. Pam handled the calls while I prepped food bowls, and through it all, I kept glancing into the recovery room. Bear was awake, but didn't move much. He watched everything with those big eyes that seemed to carry more wisdom than any dog should have. Whiskers had improved slightly. She managed to wobble to the litter box and back without toppling over, and she'd started eating tiny bits of wet food on her own. That alone felt like a small miracle. 2 days later, I noticed something new. Bear didn't just watch Whiskers move. He adjusted his position to give her space, waited patiently while she climbed over his legs, and even used his nose to gently nudge her away from sharp corners. He was acting like a dad. Not in some anthropomorphic cartoon way, just in that steady, quiet way animals sometimes take care of each other when they know they need to. We had their follow-up appointment at Dr. Landry's that Friday. I was a little nervous about moving both of them, but they handled the car ride better than I expected. Whiskers mewed a little, but curled up in the soft crate with Bear's paw pressed against the mesh. Bear didn't move the whole ride, just kept his eyes half closed, his breathing calm. Dr. Landry greeted us with a chuckle. "Your miracle team returns." He examined Whiskers first. Her leg had responded well to the splint, but he still recommended surgery for a proper realignment. "She's young, which is in her favor," he said. "Bones are more forgiving at this age." Bear's exam took longer. Blood work, hydration checks, pressure testing on his joints. The old wound on his shoulder had scabbed nicely, and his breathing was more regular now. But there was something in the way he limped that made Dr. Landry frown. "I'd like to do an X-ray," he said, "just to be thorough." While we waited for the results, I took Whiskers out into the small patch of grass behind the clinic. She sniffed the air like it was a brand new planet. A dragonfly zipped past her, and she tried to pounce but ended up rolling onto her side, blinking in surprise. I picked her up and whispered, "You'll get it next time, kid." When we went back in, Dr. Landry looked more serious than before. He motioned me over to the light board where Bear's scan was displayed. "See this?" he said, pointing to the lower spine. "Old fracture. He's healed, but not correctly. Probably happened years ago. That's why he's limping. There's some arthritic buildup, too." "Can it be fixed?" I asked. "No," he said gently. "But it can be managed. Anti-inflammatories, gentle exercise, a proper diet. He'll need soft bedding and limited stairs. Nothing too demanding." I looked at Bear, still resting in the exam room, eyes half closed. "He doesn't need to run marathons. He just needs a home." Dr. Landry nodded. "Then let's make sure he gets one." Back at the shelter, we posted an update on our website. Bear's X-rays. Whiskers playing in the grass. We titled it, "Their Journey Isn't Over Yet." People responded in droves. Offers to adopt, donations to cover surgery, even hand-sewn sweaters and booties for Bear's old joints. A family in Oregon offered to fly out and adopt them both, until they learned Bear might not make it through long flights. We talked it through and decided we'd wait. Bear and Whiskers weren't ready yet. Not physically, not emotionally. They needed to recover in a place where they were known, where they had quiet, steady care. So we kept them. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine. Feedings, vet check-ins, litter training for Whiskers. We moved Bear to the front room of the shelter so he could watch people come and go. At first he just observed, but then he started wagging his tail again. Little flicks. Then full thumps. And Whiskers? She took to climbing everything. Boxes. Crates. My back. She'd scamper halfway up Bear's side and plop down like she'd conquered a mountain. One morning, I found her sitting in Bear's food bowl. Not eating. Just sitting. Looking proud. "She thinks she owns this place," Pam said with a laugh. "She kind of does." We had one close call. A storm rolled through in the middle of the night and knocked out power. The backup generator kicked in, but not before Bear started pacing. He was anxious, kept whining, scratched the door until I came down from the staff quarters and sat with him. It hit me then. Maybe storms reminded him of something. Maybe the night he found Whiskers. Maybe whatever came before that. I sat with him in the dark, flashlight casting soft shadows, and hummed low tunes until he settled. Whiskers, curled in my hoodie pocket, never stirred. When the lights came back, Bear didn't move for a long time. He just lay beside me, breathing deep, paw resting over the pocket where Whiskers slept. Pam found us there in the morning and didn't say a word. Just brought coffee and a fresh blanket. In all that time, no one came looking for Bear. No reports of missing dogs, no old flyers, no one recognizing him from the photos. It was as if he'd come from nowhere and brought his story with him. But to us, he wasn't just a story. He was Bear, the dog who walked through a storm carrying life in his jaws, the one who refused to let go. And the kitten he saved, she wasn't just a survivor. She was becoming something more. She had sass, grit, a spark that turned on the moment she felt safe, and every day they grew stronger. Together. The first time Bear barked, it startled everyone. Not because it was loud or angry, but because he hadn't made a sound in nearly 3 weeks. He'd whined softly, let out low sighs when tired, and occasionally huffed when the kittens in the next pen got too rowdy. But a bark? That was new. It happened one late morning when a group of school kids came in for their scheduled visit. We'd started doing these field trips every other Friday. A few parents and teachers would bring small groups of first and second graders through the shelter, and we'd let them meet the animals, talk about how to treat pets kindly, and hopefully inspire a few future rescuers. Bear was in his usual spot near the front room, lying on his bed while Whiskers sprawled out across his back, pretending to sleep, but clearly enjoying the attention. She'd grown considerably, now almost twice her original size, and her limp was almost gone. The kids came in, all chatter and wide eyes. A few pointed at Bear. One girl even whispered, "He's huge," like she'd spotted a lion behind glass. But the moment one of the boys, barely taller than the counter, held out a crumpled granola bar and started walking toward the pen, Bear let out a single bark. Not aggressive, not even loud, just firm. The boy froze. The adults did too. I moved quickly and gently redirected him, crouching beside Bear's space. "It's okay," I said quietly. "He's just saying no, thank you." Bear didn't move. He watched with calm eyes, then turned his head back to Whiskers, who hadn't budged an inch. After the group left, Pam looked at me from across the lobby. "He's not just recovering, he's guarding." I nodded. He's telling the world she's his. In the days that followed, Bear became more vocal. Not often, not noisy, just enough to let you know he was present. He started wagging his tail more when he saw people he recognized. He even took short walks outside with the volunteers, letting them hook a leash to his harness and leading them slowly across the grassy back lot. Whiskers followed those walks religiously. We tried to keep her inside at first, worried she'd fall behind or get distracted, but she wouldn't have it. She'd meow and scratch the door until someone let her out. Then she'd trot behind Bear, pausing only to sniff a patch of dandelions or swat at invisible foes. One time she even rode on his back for a few steps, gripping his fur like she thought she was on a parade float. It was impossible not to smile around them. The shelter itself was doing better too. Donations were up. More people were stopping by just to visit Bear and Whiskers. Kids drew pictures of them. Someone even painted a mural of the two on the fence outside. Bear's golden fur and Whiskers' gray stripe nestled together under a full moon. But not all days were easy. One morning, Bear didn't get up for breakfast. He just lay there, breathing shallow, ignoring the bowl I set down beside him. His eyes looked heavy, his limbs stiff. I panicked. We rushed him back to Dr. Landry, who ran tests and administered fluids. Nothing acute showed up, but the vet suspected old pain, spine flare-ups, maybe a stomach issue from a treat someone had snuck in. It was a harsh reminder that Bear wasn't a young dog, no matter how brave his story made him seem. He bounced back 2 days later, like nothing had happened. But I didn't. I spent the night after that visit curled up in the office, watching the security monitor that showed Bear and Whiskers sleeping together. Every time Bear shifted, I flinched. Every time Whiskers nudged him with her nose, I held my breath. Pam found me again the next morning, still in the same hoodie from yesterday, and handed me a breakfast sandwich. "You gotta sleep," she said. "I will. Just not yet." We took new photos that week. Bear outside in the grass, Whiskers balanced on a log, both of them side by side in the doorway of the shelter as the sun rose behind them. We updated their online profile too, just in case the right person was out there waiting. Still, we weren't pushing adoption. Not yet. One afternoon, an older couple from upstate drove 3 hours just to meet Bear. They'd seen the videos, read every post, and even brought a hand-knit quilt they'd made for him. We let them in slowly, gave them space, and watched as Bear sniffed their hands, accepted a gentle pat, then walked away and laid beside Whiskers. The couple looked at each other, smiled, and said, "He's home already. We don't want to take him from her." Pam and I exchanged a glance. "Some animals come to stay," she said. Whiskers had her surgery the following week. We prepped as carefully as we could. The vet team was confident, but it was still a delicate procedure. I stayed in the waiting room the entire time, Bear pacing beside me, leash tight in my hand. He whined once when the door closed behind the surgical team. 2 hours later, Dr. Landry came out with a tired smile. "She did great. She'll keep the leg." Bear and I waited by the recovery crate until she stirred. When she finally opened her eyes and let out a soft mewl, Bear licked the corner of the mesh like he was reassuring her. We brought them home, because by then, the shelter really was their home, and settled them back into their shared room. Whiskers had a tiny cone around her head, and Bear took to grooming her face around the edges like he was trying to clean the world off her. Sometimes I wondered what Bear's past looked like, where he came from, what kind of life led him to that rainy morning, trudging through the woods with a kitten in his jaws. We'd probably never know. But what mattered now was the present, the walks, the naps, the soft purring beside his chest. There was one particularly warm day in early spring when we opened the side yard gates and let Bear out to explore. Whiskers followed, her gait better now, even with her shaved leg still healing. The two of them walked through the tall grass, stopping by the wildflowers that had started to bloom. Whiskers pawed at a ladybug. Bear sniffed at the air like he was reading something in the wind. I sat nearby with a camera, snapping photos without thinking too much, just watching. At one point, Whiskers darted ahead, spotting a butterfly. Bear lifted his head, got up slower, and started to follow. But instead of running after her, he paused, looked back at me, and then let out a soft woof. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to call me over. I walked toward them, kneeling in the grass as Whiskers climbed a nearby stump and declared victory over her imaginary prey. Bear nuzzled my hand. I scratched behind his ears. "You're okay now," I said. He blinked up at me, then laid down again, front paws crossed, eyes half closed. That night I started writing their story, Not the one for social media or the fundraiser. Not the one the news station asked for. Just a real story. About a dog who didn't give up. About a kitten who refused to stop trying. About the space between them that somehow pulled both back to life. Bear's bark returned more often. Whiskers started climbing furniture she had no business reaching. And I began to realize something very quietly, somewhere between evening feedings and early morning check-ins. Maybe Bear hadn't just saved Whiskers. Maybe she'd saved him too. The letter came in a pale blue envelope with a smudge of dirt along one edge, like someone had dropped it on the ground and picked it up in a rush. It didn't look like anything official. No return address, no company logo, just a name written in small, careful handwriting across the top. To the person who took in the golden dog. It was mid-April, and the last frost had just melted from the grass behind the shelter. We'd been preparing for the spring adoption event, setting up tables and stringing handmade banners across the chain-link fence. Volunteers were in and out, mostly teens on spring break trying to rack up service hours, and the place buzzed with activity. But that letter stopped me cold. I opened it slowly, expecting maybe a thank you from a visitor or someone who'd seen Bear and Whiskers online. But it wasn't that. Not exactly. The letter was from a man named Eli, who lived in a small town 2 counties over. He explained in neat but hesitant lines that about 6 months earlier, he'd seen a large golden dog near an abandoned farm at the edge of his property. The dog had been thin, skittish, and clearly not well. He'd tried to leave food out. Once, he even managed to get within a few feet, but the dog bolted. Then winter came, and the sightings stopped. I thought maybe he'd passed, Eli wrote. But then someone at the feed store showed me a news clip with your shelter's name. I saw the dog's picture and knew it had to be him. He didn't ask for the dog back. He didn't make any demands. What he wrote instead was something simple. I never got to help him. Thank you for doing what I couldn't. I read it twice, then a third time. Then I folded it neatly and tucked it into the front desk drawer. Bear was in the front yard with Whiskers when I went looking for him. They were doing their usual routine, Bear watching the clouds roll overhead, and Whiskers trying to climb a bush that definitely wasn't built for climbing. I called them in for lunch, and Bear gave me a slow, lumbering trot, while Whiskers dashed in ahead, already yowling for food. There were moments now, little ones, where I could almost forget how they'd started. The rain, the wounds, the desperate look in Bear's eyes when he collapsed on the steps. Now he moved like he belonged here, like he expected the world to make space for him. And maybe it had. We kept the adoption event light and easy. Local bakeries donated cookies. A few kids sold lemonade for the shelter fund. We had booths set up with face painting and handmade pet toys. But the real draw, of course, was Bear and Whiskers. We set them up in a shady area under the oak tree near the center of the yard. Bear had his thick mat and a water bowl, and Whiskers had a little platform she could climb up on to survey the crowd. They greeted visitors calmly, Bear wagging his tail in slow arcs, and Whiskers meowing in short, polite bursts. You'd think they were seasoned celebrities. It was midway through the event when something odd happened. A woman in her 50s walked up quietly, not saying much, just watching them. She had soft gray hair, pulled back in a clip, and her eyes flicked from Bear to Whiskers like she was sorting through a memory. She didn't say anything at first, just crouched down near the pen and whispered something I couldn't hear. Bear stood up, sniffed her hand, then licked her palm once. Whiskers, ever the curious one, jumped down and inspected the woman's shoes. Later, she came over and introduced herself as Marie. She'd lost her dog the year before, another golden mix, older, sweet as pie. Said she hadn't been able to think about adopting again until she saw Bear's story in the local paper. "I don't think I'm ready yet," she said. "But seeing them, it helps." That stuck with me. These two weren't just animals people wanted to adopt. They were something people needed to see. Symbols, maybe. Reminders that love could show up in the middle of a storm and carry something broken until it healed. A week after the event, we received another package, this time a painting. It was a watercolor of Bear and Whiskers side by side under the oak tree, the banner in the background reading, "Second chances start here." There was no note, just a name signed at the bottom, Marie. We framed it and hung it above the front desk. By early May, Whiskers had almost no sign of her limp left. Her surgery had gone as well as we could have hoped, and her physical therapy, mostly consisting of climbing furniture and chasing leaves, had worked wonders. She was fast now, agile, almost impossible to catch unless she wanted you to. Bear was doing well too. His weight had stabilized, his fur had regained a healthy shine, and his spine, though still sensitive, was no longer a source of daily pain. We adjusted his diet, kept up with supplements, and made sure he had thick mats and soft bedding wherever he went. He even started showing interest in toys, something he hadn't done in weeks. One day, I caught him gently chewing on a stuffed raccoon. Whiskers watched from the corner, like a coach analyzing his form. Then came the application from the Walkers. They were a retired couple from just over the state line. Had a small property with a fenced yard, no other pets, no kids at home. The wife, Janice, had grown up with dogs. The husband, Doug, had just finished building a screened-in porch for the dog they hadn't adopted yet. When they saw Bear and Whiskers on the website, they knew. But we were careful. We did a home visit. We checked the yard, the food they planned to use, the vet they used for their last dog. Everything checked out. But I hesitated. Not because they weren't good people, they were, but because Bear and Whiskers had become part of our rhythm. Letting them go would mean rewriting everything. I talked it over with Pam. She sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the printed forms, and then looked up at me. "You're not afraid they won't be loved," she said. "You're afraid they won't love it back." She was right. So we brought them for a visit. Just a visit. We told the Walkers it was a trial. No promises. The house was simple and warm. A long gravel driveway, soft grass underfoot, a tall oak tree in the back like the one at the shelter. Bear stepped out of the car and sniffed the breeze. Whiskers leapt down and immediately started exploring the flower beds. Doug came out with a blanket draped over one arm and a tennis ball in his hand. Janice followed with a bowl of fresh water and a toy mouse. Bear looked at them, then back at me. I crouched beside him. "Just see how it feels." We stayed for an hour, then 2. By the time the sun dipped low, Bear was snoozing on the porch while Whiskers batted a moth around the edges of a potted fern. They didn't seem confused. They didn't seem lost. They just seemed okay. On the way back, Bear lay quietly in the back seat. Whiskers curled beside him, her paw tucked under his chin. I glanced in the mirror and whispered, "Do you want this?" Neither moved. But when we pulled into the shelter parking lot and I opened the door, Bear didn't jump out, he just looked at me. Then he nudged Whiskers gently, like telling her it was time to wake up. I left the decision to them. I really did. That night I didn't fill their food bowls. I left them out, just in case. I didn't shut the lights all the way off in the recovery room. I left the door ajar, just in case. By morning, they were both curled together in the pen. But the next week, when we drove back to the Walker's place for a second visit, Bear walked up to the porch without a single look back. Whiskers followed him inside. And for the first time in a long time, the shelter felt a little too quiet. The morning after Bear and Whiskers stayed at the Walker's place for the second time, I walked into the shelter feeling something I hadn't expected. Hesitation. Not dread. Not sadness. Just a strange stillness, like the routine had changed without anyone asking me. Their space was empty, the bed perfectly fluffed but unoccupied, the food bowls still gleaming clean from the night before. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the corner where Bear usually rested, and where Whiskers used to chase her tail in a circle until she made herself dizzy. Pam arrived 10 minutes later with a bag of donuts and 2 coffees. She stopped when she saw me frozen in the recovery room doorway. "They're not ghosts," she said gently. I gave a short laugh, but it caught in my throat. "No, they're just gone. Or halfway gone." She handed me the coffee. "They're at a sleepover with potential parents. Remember when we used to hope for this?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I agreed. When they'd first arrived, all I'd hoped for was survival, then recovery. Then, well, I guess I hadn't planned that far. Not emotionally, anyway. By midday, we were buried in the usual work, sorting the new litter of kittens brought in by animal control, organizing the new donation bins from the local school fundraiser, and helping 2 families meet the right dogs for adoption. It was the kind of day that used to feel normal, but now there was a layer of quiet behind it all. Like we were waiting for something we didn't want to admit we were waiting for. At around 3:00 p.m., the shelter phone rang. I was knee-deep in kibble bags when Pam picked it up. Her voice lifted as she spoke. "Oh, hi, Janice. Yes, of course. Really? That's... wow, okay." She turned to me, her eyebrows raised. I mouthed, "What?" She held the receiver away for a second. "They want to come back, just to visit. They said Bear's been staring at the gate all morning." I dropped the bag of kibble and wiped my hands. "I'll go get the pen ready." Janice and Doug pulled into the parking lot just past 4, and before they were even out of the car, Bear started barking from the back seat. It was that low, happy bark I hadn't heard in weeks, the kind he used when Whiskers darted across the porch or when a volunteer brought a squeaky toy. When the door opened, he bounded out like a dog half his age. His limp was still there, sure, but it didn't slow him down. Whiskers, tucked in a soft crate, let out a sharp meow as if to say, "Wait for me!" I knelt on the grass as Bear came running, his whole body wagging. He stopped just short of bowling me over, pressed his head to my chest, then circled once and flopped down, letting out a breath like he'd just finished a long shift. Whiskers was released a moment later and came trotting over with far more dignity, brushing past Bear's tail and settling near my knee. Her eyes were bright, confident. Doug and Janice stood back and watched with quiet smiles. "We told them we'd just go for a drive," Janice said. "Didn't mention where." "They figured it out anyway," Doug added. "Bear spent the whole morning by the fence, looking south." We brought them inside for a short visit. Bear headed straight to his old bed like he'd never left, spinning once before plopping down with a heavy sigh. Whiskers leapt onto the windowsill and began swatting at a fly trapped between the panes. It felt like slipping into a pair of well-worn shoes. Familiar. Easy. But then something changed. At the end of the visit, when it was time to leave, Bear hesitated. not dramatically. Not with whining or resistance, just a pause at the threshold of the shelter door. He looked at me, then looked back at his spot in the corner. Whiskers, meanwhile, made a beeline for Janice's feet. She sat down by her carrier without being asked, tail flicking contentedly. I walked them out, heart buzzing with conflict. I told Janice and Doug to give it one more week. Let them stay. See how it felt. They agreed. No pressure. No promises. That night, I lingered in the recovery room after everyone else had gone home. I sat on the edge of the empty mattress and let the quiet wrap around me. I remembered the way Bear used to look up at me in the middle of the night checks. How Whiskers would worm her way under my arm like she was trying to disappear into warmth. I missed that. But I also knew I wasn't the only one who'd earned a happy ending. Over the next few days, updates rolled in. Doug sent videos of Bear watching squirrels from the porch. Tail flicking, ears perked. Janice sent a photo of Whiskers asleep in a sunbeam, curled around a chew toy twice her size. The messages weren't frequent, but they were honest. And they helped. Meanwhile, life at the shelter moved forward. We had a dozen new animals arrive that week, most with their own set of troubles. A 3-legged Chihuahua who'd been left behind during a move. A terrier with a fear of doorways. A blind cat who purred every time someone said his name. And among them all, I started seeing small echoes of Bear and Whiskers. Moments, expressions, little reminders that resilience wasn't rare. It just needed time, space, and kindness to bloom. Then came the call that nearly knocked me over. It was from a producer. Local news again, though this time it wasn't just a 10-minute segment. They were putting together a documentary on animal rescue and had chosen our shelter as one of their features. Not because we were the biggest or the flashiest, but because of Bear and Whiskers. "They've become something of a symbol," the producer said. "We want to show people what it means to fight for each other." The crew arrived 2 weeks later. Cameras, lights, microphones. At first, it made everyone nervous. The animals picked up on the energy, and we had more than a few false starts. But by the 3rd day, things settled. And on the 4th day, Doug and Janice brought Bear and Whiskers back. It wasn't permanent, just for the filming. But when they arrived, it felt like a reunion. Bear greeted each staff member in turn, leaning his weight against legs, resting his head in familiar laps. Whiskers made herself right at home, inspecting the camera bags like she was in charge. The crew captured it all. The footage of Bear walking the perimeter of the yard like a gentle guard. Whiskers chasing dandelion fluff across the grass. The two of them curled up together beneath the mural someone had painted last fall. I did an interview too. They asked me what made this story different. I didn't have to think long. Because Bear wasn't just saving her, I said. He was saving something in himself, and in all of us, maybe. The documentary aired the following month. People from all over the country reached out. Letters, emails, donations. But the most unexpected response came from a group of middle schoolers in Kansas who'd watched it during a homeroom period. They'd started a fundraiser, calling it Bear's Blanket Drive, collecting supplies for their local shelter. In their letter, they wrote, "If a dog can carry a kitten through a storm, we can carry a few blankets through the rain." I printed that letter and hung it beside Marie's painting. Bear and Whiskers didn't return full-time after the shoot, but they visited now and then. We became their second home, and they never forgot it. Every time they came back, Bear would do a slow lap of the shelter, like checking the perimeter. Whiskers would leap onto the filing cabinet in the office and demand treats. And when they left, they always looked back, Just once. Just long enough to say, "We remember." It was enough. Summer at the shelter always brought with it a kind of chaos that no amount of preparation could fully tame. With schools out, vacationers passing through, and kitten season in full swing, the shelter became a revolving door of fur, noise, and stories waiting to be rewritten. But even in the whirlwind, there were constants, Bear and Whiskers being two of them. Not by their physical presence anymore, not daily, but by the space they still filled in the building's spirit. Since the documentary aired, we'd seen a surge in volunteers, donors, and even media inquiries. A few producers wanted to make Bear and Whiskers into a children's book. Someone pitched a plush toy set. One local artist even brought in a hand-carved wooden statue of the two, carved from driftwood found along the riverbed near where Bear was first spotted months ago. It stood now at the front desk, Whiskers perched on Bear's back, eyes bright and curious. People took photos with it, but not everything was sunshine and fan mail. With more exposure came more animals. Abandonments spiked, maybe because people assumed we now had resources to spare. Strays were dropped off in boxes, some left tied to the back fence. A few arrived too late. And as always, we made space where we could, and mourned when we couldn't. In the middle of all this, Bear and Whiskers came back for a week. Doug and Janice had to travel unexpectedly, an ailing relative out in New Mexico, and they asked if we could care for their two for a short while. The answer was yes before they finished the sentence. When Bear stepped through the doors again, it was like nothing had changed. He made his rounds slowly, sniffing the door frames, nudging open the supply closet, inspecting the staff break room as if checking to see who'd been slacking off. Whiskers didn't wait. She bounded down the hallway, leapt onto the copy machine, and immediately began batting at the hanging paper clips beside Pam's desk. We hadn't realized how much we missed them until they returned. It was like a missing note being added back to a song. The rhythm felt complete again. I set up their old space, now occupied by a younger retriever with separation issues named Tilly. Tilly had been with us for just 2 weeks and barked at her own shadow, but the moment she saw Bear, she went silent. Bear approached slowly, gave a single sniff, and then sat. Tilly, wide-eyed, lay down beside him like she'd known him forever. Whiskers, meanwhile, had claimed a new territory, our upstairs records office. She squeezed under the door and made a nest out of the old cardboard box of discontinued brochures. When I tried to coax her out, she stared at me like royalty being inconvenienced. Pam shook her head when I told her. "We've been replaced by a box." "It was bound to happen," I said. During that week, something changed, not just in the animals, but in the staff. We all slowed down a bit, took our time during check-ins, spent a few more minutes brushing coats or just sitting on the floor. It was like Bear reminded us how important stillness could be, that waiting with someone was sometimes the loudest form of love. We had a new intern that week too, Elliot, 17, quiet, and clearly overwhelmed by the daily demands of shelter life. On his second day, he accidentally spilled 2 cans of wet cat food onto his shoes. On his third, he cried when a beagle mix he'd grown attached to got adopted. That Thursday, I found him sitting alone in the hallway beside Bear. "You okay?" I asked, crouching next to him. He nodded, then looked at Bear. "He just sat with me. Sometimes that's all we need." Elliot reached out, ran his hand through Bear's thick fur. "He's like a lighthouse." It struck me as one of the most accurate things I'd heard anyone say. That night, Bear barked sharply around midnight. I was the only staff member on the night shift, so I rushed to the front, heart pounding, flashlight swinging. He was pacing the main hallway, Whiskers right behind him, her tail high and puffed. When I followed their gaze, I saw what they'd sensed before I did. Someone had left a small crate just outside the shelter doors. No note, no sign of who had placed it. Inside was a shivering, mud-covered puppy, barely old enough to be away from its mother. A chocolate lab mix, maybe 5 weeks old, her eyes crusted with infection. I scooped her up and rushed inside, cranking up the heat, preparing fluids. Bear stood close the entire time, watching. Not interfering, just being there. When the puppy let out a faint whimper, Whiskers jumped onto the counter and meowed. The next morning, the puppy was still weak but stable. Bear curled up near her crate and didn't move for hours. We named her Maple. Maple became the next project. Volunteers doted on her. Elliot hand-fed her goat's milk. Whiskers began leaving toys near her crate, like offerings. It was like they all remembered what it felt like to be rescued. When Janice and Doug returned, we expected Bear and Whiskers to leap into the car without hesitation. And they did. But not before visiting Maple. Bear licked her nose once. Whiskers jumped onto the edge of the crate and gave a soft purr. Doug watched it all and said, "They've passed something on, haven't they?" Pam nodded. Like a torch. And maybe that's what it was. Bear and Whiskers stayed just one more night before heading back home. We packed their favorite blankets, gave them treats for the road, and watched the car pull away. Elliot stood beside me on the curb. "Why does it hurt when they leave?" he asked. "Because they matter." Maple's recovery wasn't fast, but it was sure. She gained weight, her eyes cleared, and she started exploring her surroundings with that wobble-legged courage only puppies have. And every time she did something new, climb a step, bark at her reflection, drag a slipper across the room. We thought of Bear. Pam printed out a photo from the security camera. Bear standing over Maple's crate, Whiskers peering from behind the counter. She taped it up beside the front desk under the word Guardians. Summer marched on. The heat came. The new litters arrived. More adoptions. More farewells. But through it all, Bear and Whiskers remained part of us. And every once in a while, just before lights out, I'd walk the halls and swear I saw a big golden shadow pass by the door, followed by a small streak of gray. And I'd smile, knowing we were never truly alone. By mid-July, the air in Ridgewood got so thick you could practically chew it. The summer heat clung to the trees, melted the tar in the parking lot, and slowed the shelter into a kind of sleepy rhythm. Animals spent their afternoons sprawled on tile floors near fans, staff tied their hair up and doubled their water intake, and everything took just a little longer to get done. We were short-handed again. One of the college volunteers had gone home early, and Pam had caught a summer flu that kept her out for a few days. That week, I was running almost every task alone, from food prep to intake paperwork to walking the dogs. Normally, the work grounded me, gave me a clear rhythm to follow. But without Bear and Whiskers around, the heart of the place felt a little quiet, even as the chaos carried on. Then came Thursday. I was halfway through my third bottle of lukewarm water when I heard the chime of the front door. Not the usual hesitant kind from new adopters or shy families. This one was hurried, like someone had barged in without thinking twice. I walked out from the back room and nearly tripped over my own shoes. It was Janice. She looked winded, like she'd run from the car. Her face flushed, hair pulled back in a loose braid, and she was holding something in her arms. It was Whiskers. "She got out this morning," Janice said, breathing hard. "We couldn't find her for 2 hours. Then Doug heard her yowling in the garage. She'd squeezed behind a shelf and wouldn't come out. When I finally coaxed her out, she was limping. Again. I reached for her gently, and Janice transferred the little gray bundle into my arms. Whiskers looked up at me, wide-eyed and shaking. Her front paw hung slightly, not broken, but swollen. "She's been trying to leap up onto everything lately," Janice said. "I think she misjudged. I feel so awful." I shook my head. "Don't. She's bold. That hasn't changed." I carried Whiskers to the exam table in the back, and Janice followed. I started checking her over, palpating the limb gently, feeling for fractures. She hissed once, then went quiet. Janice wrung her hands nearby. "How's Bear?" I asked. "He's fine. Pacing, though. Kept sniffing the door even after we got her inside. He knows she's not supposed to be away from him." Janice smiled, but her eyes were misty. Dr. Landry came over as soon as I called. We took Whiskers in for a quick scan, just to be sure, and confirmed it was only a mild sprain. He wrapped the limb, gave us instructions for rest, and prescribed a mild anti-inflammatory. Whiskers meowed the whole way back to the shelter, not in pain, but as if she was giving us a full report of what had happened. We kept her overnight, just to monitor. I set her up in a quiet room, gave her a soft fleece pad, and dimmed the lights. She curled up in the far corner, watching everything with that intense little stare she always had. Doug brought Bear in just after dinner. The moment he stepped through the doors, the tension melted off his shoulders. He sniffed the air, followed the trail of Whiskers' scent like a bloodhound, and found her room in under a minute. When I opened the door, Bear padded in slowly. Whiskers raised her head, gave a weak chirp, and Bear immediately lay down beside her. No dramatics. No whining. Just presence. Doug rubbed the back of his neck. "He hasn't eaten all day. Now I know why." I nodded. They're still each other's compass. We let them stay overnight, both of them, tucked together in the same room. I brought in one of the thick orthopedic beds from storage and placed it under the window. By midnight, they were curled up in a tangle of gray and gold, fast asleep. In the morning, Whiskers was better. Not healed yet, but clearly in less pain. She purred when I brought in her breakfast. Bear, of course, ate only after she'd finished. They stayed for 3 more days, while Janice and Doug handled some home repairs and set up a new safety gate in the garage. In those days, it was like the shelter had its heart beating properly again. Bear resumed his patrols, slowly checking each kennel, occasionally pausing to sniff the newer residents. Whiskers returned to her perch atop the filing cabinet, watching me type reports with unblinking judgment. Elliot was thrilled to see them. He came in early each morning just to sit in the recovery room with them. Sometimes he brought books, reading aloud in a soft voice while Bear snoozed and Whiskers batted at the bookmarks. On the second afternoon, we brought in a new intake, an older corgi mix named Fen. He was barrel-chested, low to the ground, and completely uninterested in people. According to his paperwork, he'd been found wandering near an abandoned playground, no collar, underweight, with a nasty gash on his side. Fen didn't bark or growl. He just stared at walls and refused to eat. We gave him space, tried different foods, soft words, treats. Nothing worked. That night, Bear walked past his kennel and stopped. Just stopped. Then he sat down in front of the door and stayed there for 10 minutes. When he finally stood and walked away, Fen got up and moved to the front of the kennel for the first time. In the morning, he ate. No one said it out loud, but we all noticed. Bear had a way of knowing who needed something. Sometimes it was presents, sometimes just a look. Whatever it was, it worked. That weekend, we held another open day. Visitors from the next county came through, some looking to adopt, others just wanting to meet Bear and Whiskers. We placed a jar on the counter labeled Maple's Friends to raise funds for vaccinations, and a little boy dropped in $3 and a sticky lollipop. It was more meaningful than a $100 check. Bear and Whiskers handled the crowd like pros. Bear sat calmly while kids leaned against him. Parents asked about his story, and Whiskers chased bubbles someone brought from the dollar store. It was the kind of day that reminded us why we kept doing this work, even when it was hard. At the end of the event, Janice and Doug returned. Whiskers' paw had healed enough for her to go home. She walked on it with only a slight limp, barely noticeable. Doug bent down and rubbed Bear's neck. "You ready, big guy?" Bear looked back at us, at the shelter, at the staff. Then he walked forward. I crouched beside him one last time and whispered, "You always know when it's time." That night, the shelter felt quieter again. Not empty, not lonely, just in between. The kind of quiet that lets you reflect and plan for what comes next. 2 weeks after Bear and Whiskers went back home, I found myself pausing outside their old room, more often than I cared to admit. The bedding had been cleaned and stored, the toys donated to younger residents, and the crate moved to another corner. Still, the space held a sort of echo, like a song you can't quite hear but keep humming anyway. It was strange how much of a rhythm they had created, how their daily rituals had shaped ours. Pam was finally back on her feet after her bout with the flu, though she walked around with a scarf like she was still fighting a draft. She didn't say much about the absence either, but I caught her once, staring at the mural someone had painted of Bear and Whiskers under the oak tree. She was holding a clipboard and didn't realize I was watching. Her thumb slowly brushed the painted edge of Whiskers' tail before she turned away and went back to inventory. I buried myself in work. The fall intake season was creeping in early. Shelters like ours always saw a spike as families adjusted to back-to-school schedules and realized they couldn't keep the summer pets. Puppies once given as birthday gifts were now too energetic for busy households. Elderly dogs whose owners had moved into assisted living. Pregnant strays showing up on porches and under sheds. It was relentless, but it was the work we chose. One morning, we took in a pit lab mix with a head too big for her body and a bark like a foghorn. Her name, according to the tag tied to her collar with dental floss, was Rue. She was nervous, almost vibrating with tension. Not aggressive, but unsure of everything. It took 3 people to get her into a kennel, not because she fought, but because she froze. We sat with her for an hour just to help her feel okay. That same day, we received a message from Doug. Bear wasn't doing well. It wasn't anything specific. No injury, no obvious illness. But he had started sleeping more, eating slower, and walking with greater difficulty. The vet couldn't find anything life-threatening, but Bear seemed tired. Not just physically, but in that heavy, quiet way that's harder to treat. "He still perks up when he hears Whiskers," Doug said. "But it's like something in him is slowing." I stared at the message for a long time. I asked Doug if he'd consider bringing Bear by for a few days. A change of environment. Familiar faces. Just to see if it helped. The next morning, Bear stepped out of their car slower than before. His gait had stiffened, and his back legs trembled slightly when he turned. But when he saw the shelter building, his ears lifted. Not fully, but enough. Whiskers was already in her carrier, yowling her discontent about being transported again, But once she saw Bear moving toward the front door, she settled. We set them up in a different room this time, one with more space and an orthopedic bed elevated just a few inches off the floor. Bear climbed onto it with some effort, and then let out a groan that could only be described as satisfied. Whiskers, ever observant, jumped up beside him, curled into the crook of his belly, and purred so loud the windows could have rattled. They stayed with us for a full week. Bear moved slower, yes, but there was a calm in him, like he was visiting a favorite place one last time. He spent long hours just lying in the sun that poured through the window, blinking slowly at the volunteers who passed through. He accepted treats with grace, tolerated hugs from new kids, and still made his rounds each morning with a kind of methodical dignity. Whiskers, in contrast, had grown more spirited. She would dart through the hallways like a wind-up toy, hide behind doors, and leap out at unsuspecting interns. Her limp was completely gone now, and her coat had turned silky and full. When she finally paused long enough to rest, it was always beside Bear. One afternoon, a teenage boy named Theo, who'd just started volunteering, asked if he could draw them. "Of course," I said. He returned the next day with a sketch pad, sat in the corner for 2 hours, and didn't speak once. When he left, he handed me a page. Pencil drawing, soft lines, Bear sleeping with Whiskers perched on top, eyes half closed but alert. I tacked it beside the front desk, beside all the other artwork people had left. Some of the regulars started calling that spot the Wall of Bear, but it wasn't about glorifying him, it was about remembering what quiet strength looked like. Midway through the week, we had a small emergency. A storm rolled in suddenly, heavy wind, lightning, the kind that rattled the windows and flooded the parking lot in under an hour. Power flickered twice before the generator kicked in. Animals howled. Rue barked non-stop, pawing at her kennel like she was trying to dig through it. I ran to her first. She was trembling, crouched low, eyes wide with panic. I opened the door slowly, unsure of what she'd do, but instead of bolting, she pressed herself against me and whined. I held her until she stopped shaking. When I stood, Bear was there. He must have heard the storm and decided to check in. He nudged my leg, then walked slowly toward Rue's kennel and sat. Rue inched forward. Her nose touched the gate. Then, gently, Bear laid his head down on his front paws and closed his eyes. Rue laid down too. The lights stabilized. The wind passed. Rue didn't bark again. By the time Doug and Janice returned at the end of the week, Bear looked more rested. Not younger, not stronger, but steadier, like he'd remembered who he was. We didn't say much during the pickup. Doug thanked us. Janice hugged Pam. Whiskers sat proudly in her carrier, tail flicking like she owned the place. Bear gave one last look as he stepped into the back of the car. His gaze lingered, not at the building, not at us, but at Rue's kennel. When they left, I sat on the curb a while, sipping water from a bottle gone warm. That night, Rue did something new. She barked twice, once at the door, once at the window, and then lay down with her chin on her paws. We checked the footage from the hallway camera later. Bear had stopped by her kennel every night that week. Not long, not loud, just enough to let her know he was there. The first leaves began to turn by the second week of September. The heat that had gripped Ridgewood for most of the summer slowly faded into that golden kind of warmth that hints at cooler nights ahead. You could smell it in the air, damp earth, pine needles, and something almost sweet that lingered under the sun. The shelter shifted with the season. Blankets came out of storage. The outdoor pens were cleaned for the last time before the rains, and the dogs began to spend longer hours snoozing in sunbeams rather than panting under fans. There was a peace to it, the kind that made you stop in the middle of your workday and listen to nothing for a few minutes. Bear and Whiskers had been home for 3 weeks now. Doug sent updates every Friday like clockwork. Nothing dramatic, just simple lines. Bear got up easier today. Whiskers is hunting leaves again. Bear barked in his sleep. Twice. I didn't ask for more than that. I didn't need to. Here at the shelter, Rue was making progress. She no longer paced in circles when left alone. She barked with purpose instead of panic. Elliot had taken a particular liking to her, even started teaching her how to give paw for treats. She tried. Mostly she flopped. But she flopped with effort. One afternoon, I was brushing a new arrival, a skinny golden terrier with mismatched ears, when the doorbell chimed again. It was unusual for anyone to come without an appointment, so I wiped my hands on a towel and walked up front. There stood a girl, maybe 11, freckles, chipped pink nail polish, a backpack too large for her. She was holding a leash. At the end of it was a dog, shaggy and uncertain, with a tail curled tightly between his legs. "Hi," she said. "My dad said we can't keep him anymore. We're moving. He said if I wanted him to be okay, I should bring him here." The words came out like a rehearsed line. I nodded and knelt down. "What's his name?" "Moss. I named him because he likes rolling in it." I reached for the leash. Moss stepped back, then forward, then sat. "Thank you for bringing him," I said. "That was brave." The girl didn't cry. She didn't even blink fast like she was trying not to. She simply handed me the leash, gave Moss one last scratch behind the ears, and walked out the door. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. Moss turned to watch her go, sat at the door for a long minute, then looked at me. It took him 3 days to eat. Rue sat outside his kennel the second night, pressed against the doorframe like she was standing guard. I left them like that for an hour, came back, and they were both asleep. Moss inside the kennel, Rue curled up right outside. They became fast friends after that. Not playful, not yet, but gentle companions. Rue taught Moss how to sit at the back gate and wait for biscuits. Moss taught Rue how to drink from the tall fountain without getting water up her nose. When the Walkers brought Bear and Whiskers in for their next visit, it was a surprise. No email this time. Just Doug's familiar truck pulling up as I was finishing afternoon rounds. Bear stepped down slowly. His movement had become more deliberate, but his eyes still carried that steady light. Whiskers leapt out after him, tail high, stretching her legs like she hadn't moved in a week. I greeted them both with a slow wave. "Back so soon?" Doug smiled. "They've been restless. We figured you wouldn't mind." "Mind?" I nearly laughed. Bear walked inside, paused, and sniffed the air. Then, as if on a mission, he made a slow turn toward Moss's kennel. Moss watched him approach, ears twitching. Rue stood up. Bear sat. The same ritual. Repeated. Simple. Quiet. By the next morning, Moss had wagged his tail for the first time. Not at me. Not at Elliot. At Whiskers. She'd darted past his kennel, flicked her tail in his direction, and he gave the smallest little wag, almost like a reflex. Whiskers jumped on top of the counter and meowed once, like she was taking credit. The pattern repeated for the rest of the week. Bear walked the halls every morning. Rue followed. Moss followed Rue. Whiskers appeared, disappeared, reappeared, always managing to be where she was needed, and never where you expected. That Friday, a storm rolled through. Not violent, but enough to send a drum of rain against the tin roof. Some of the younger pups barked at the thunder. Rue didn't. She sat in her kennel, calm, watching Moss. Moss was curled in the corner, not trembling, but alert. I checked on them every half hour. At midnight, I did one last round. Bear was asleep on his orthopedic pad. Whiskers was curled into a ball at his side. Rue stood near Moss's kennel. I opened her door. She stepped out. I opened Moss's. She walked in. He didn't move. She lay down. He placed his head on her back. The rain slowed. I shut the lights. 2 days later, a family came in looking to adopt. A couple with a 5-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old golden retriever at home. They didn't want a puppy. They wanted a dog who'd already learned a few things, who'd seen a bit of life. They met Rue first. She sat politely, gave her paw, barked once when prompted. The girl giggled and clapped. Then they saw Moss. He was lying on his mat, tail gently swishing. The girl approached. Moss sat up. Rue walked to his side. The girl reached out. Moss licked her hand. They adopted them both. Whiskers supervised the goodbye from atop the cubby shelf. Bear watched from the doorway, ears alert. That evening, after everything quieted down, I found Bear lying in his usual spot. He looked up, blinked slowly. I knelt down, scratched behind his ear. "You still got it." He let out a soft huff, then closed his eyes. The morning Bear didn't stand up was colder than usual. Fall had truly arrived, and the early sunlight came filtered through a veil of orange leaves. The sky was that soft kind of blue that seemed to hold its breath. When I arrived at the shelter, I noticed Doug's truck already parked out front. That wasn't strange. Sometimes he came early if Bear needed a slower walk. But the stillness around it made my chest tighten. Inside, the shelter was quiet. The usual morning chorus of barking and meowing hadn't started yet. As I made my way down the hallway, I saw Doug sitting on the bench outside the quiet room where Bear and Whiskers usually stayed when they visited. He had his hat in his hands. His eyes looked red. "He didn't get up this morning," Doug said. His voice was low, too calm. Whiskers licked his face. He opened his eyes, but he didn't move. I stepped into the room. Bear lay on his bed, his massive frame stretched across the fleece blanket we always used for him. His breathing was shallow. His eyes blinked slowly. Whiskers was curled at his side, head resting against his ribs, perfectly still. She didn't look up when I entered. I knelt beside him. "Hey, old boy." His ear twitched. That was all. Doug walked in behind me. He started eating less 2 days ago. Janice thought it might be the colder weather, or maybe the stairs starting to bother him again. But last night, I think he knew. I placed a hand gently on Bear's shoulder. His fur still carried that warmth that felt like home. "We'll get Dr. Landry. Let's make sure he's comfortable." Pam arrived not long after, followed by Elliot, who had come in early to prep kennels. We all knew before anyone said the words out loud. We moved quietly around Bear, like the air had changed. Dr. Landry arrived with a soft voice and kind eyes. He checked Bear over and confirmed what we already knew. "It's time." We gathered in the room. No one rushed. No one spoke more than necessary. Doug and Janice sat on either side of Bear, each holding one of his massive paws. Whiskers stayed where she was, unblinking, eyes wide and glassy. Dr. Landry administered the sedative. Bear's breath slowed further. When the final injection came, we all leaned in, our hands on him, our hearts in our throats. The last breath came so gently that it could have been mistaken for sleep. Whiskers finally lifted her head. She looked at each of us, one by one, then stood and walked the length of Bear's body before sitting quietly at his head. There was nothing to say. Not in that moment. We gave them time, Whiskers and Bear, before we moved. Then we wrapped him in the fleece blanket, placed him in the crate lined with pine wood, and carried him to the van with a reverence normally reserved for saints. Bear was buried beneath the oak tree behind the shelter, the one in the mural. The ground was soft from the recent rain, the wind just enough to rustle the branches above. We didn't hold a formal service, but each of us placed something beside the crate before it was lowered. A tennis ball, a treat, a sketch someone had drawn of Bear curled beside Whiskers. I placed a note. It was simple. Thank you. You saved us. Whiskers remained quiet the rest of the day. She stayed in Bear's room, curled in the corner where the sun touched the floor. We checked on her every hour. She didn't eat, but she didn't cry either. Just watched. The next morning, she climbed onto the window ledge and sat for hours, tail wrapped around her body. I brought in a heated blanket and placed it under her. She stayed there 3 days. On the 4th morning, she jumped down, walked into the hallway, and made her way to Rue's kennel. Rue was now the oldest of our current residents, though still young by most standards. She'd come far since the day she cowered behind her crate, but there was still hesitation in her, especially around strangers. When Whiskers walked up, Rue perked her ears. Whiskers stepped inside the kennel without asking, and lay down. I stared, frozen for a second, then exhaled. It wasn't long before Whiskers resumed her routines. She watched intake interviews from atop the cabinets. She followed volunteers as they restocked supplies. She even snuck into Elliot's backpack one day and made him laugh so hard he spilled his coffee. But something in her was different. She was still mischievous, still fast, but more deliberate. She sat longer in front of certain kennels. She paced the yard like Bear once had, and when new animals arrived afraid or shut down, she was the one who approached them first. One afternoon, a new cat came in, a senior tabby named Jasper, who had lived with a man who passed away. Jasper hissed at everything, swatted at anyone who came too close. Whiskers sat 3 feet away from his kennel for 2 full hours. Didn't move, didn't blink, just stayed. By the end of the day, Jasper had curled in his bed, no longer growling. Volunteers started calling Whiskers the little captain. Pam and I watched her one evening from the office window as she supervised the yard like she was guarding the world. She learned from the best, Pam said quietly. I nodded. She's not just surviving anymore. She's leading. Over the next few weeks, the shelter moved on. It had to. That's what places like ours do. We said goodbye to dogs we'd raised from near death. We welcomed new ones whose eyes held stories we hadn't read yet. Life kept arriving, loud and hopeful. But Bear was everywhere. In the mural, in the sketches, in the stories visitors still asked about, in the way we spoke to animals who didn't trust yet, in the way we sat beside a cage instead of trying to rush a bond. One weekend, a local carpenter came by with a gift. It was a wooden bench carved with the words, "For those who wait with us." It now sits under the oak tree where Bear rests, overlooking the shelter yard. Visitors sit there with new friends. Volunteers eat lunch there in the quiet. Sometimes Whiskers naps on the backrest, tail hanging lazily off the edge. A family came one afternoon to adopt their first dog. As they walked through the kennels, unsure, the daughter, maybe 6, sat on the bench. Whiskers jumped up beside her. "Is this your spot?" the girl asked. Whiskers didn't move. She just sat there, eyes on the girl, waiting. That family left with a shy mixed breed named Pepper, who had been overlooked for weeks. After they drove off, I walked over to the bench. Whiskers was still there. I sat beside her. She leaned gently into my leg. We stayed like that for a while. Just waiting, together.